So we've talked about a lot of different statistical methods this semester, and on the final exam, things are going to be mixed up out of order, just like they would be if you encountered them in the real world. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of just make an outline, some broad categories that we can put the different types of designs and types of analysis into. Okay, so one design that we've used a lot this semester is a randomized experiment with independent groups. So this is just any time where you're randomly assigning individuals to treatments, and the individuals in one group have nothing to do with the individuals in another. You're not like recording the same person multiple times or anything like that. You just have separate independent groups of individuals. So that could just be one treatment with multiple treatments. It could be like a full factorial design. And the advantage of a randomized experiment is kind of right there in the name. So randomized in this case refers to random assignment. And the purpose of including random assignment in a design is that this supports cause and effect conclusions. Supports cause and effect. So the way it does that is it creates these balanced groups. You don't have people self-selecting into treatments where you could have some confounders popping up. You're creating the groups at random, and so there shouldn't be any systematic differences between your groups. And the good thing about that is that if the only difference between the groups is the treatment, then you can be pretty confident that the treatment is what caused any effect that occurs. Some of the other designs that we've seen this semester didn't have independent groups because we had repeated measures. So this could be something like instead of having separate people try two different treatments, we might have the same person try both in a randomized order. So we've seen a couple different instances of that. Matched pairs where you're just looking at two different treatments. Randomized block designs, those can be used when you have more than two different treatments. And the advantage of having the same person try all the treatments is that it controls for person-to-person variability. Maybe I should have said individual to individual, but you get the idea. Controls for person-to-person variability. So basically, you're getting rid of all of these potential sources of unexplained variability so that it's easier to see the difference between your treatments or whatever it is you're trying to compare. So getting rid of that unexplained variability is ultimately going to increase your statistical power. So statistical power just means how likely you are to detect an effect if it's actually there. In other studies, we're not imposing any particular treatments on the individuals in the study. We're just observing to see what happens and how that could be connected to possible responses. So this is called an observational study when we don't impose any treatments. And in some cases, this is our only option. Sometimes it's not practical or it's not ethical to do a randomized experiment. But these can have their own advantages because observing things that are occurring in the real world can be more realistic in some cases. And if you have random selection, so if there's random selection, meaning that you're not just using individuals that are convenient, but you're actually selecting them at random from the population, in that case, you have a good chance of getting a representative sample. And so this is going to support generalizability. So notice this is a different concern than cause and effect. They're both important, but here we're not talking about did the explanatory cause the response, but we're just saying this relationship that we have observed, do we think that it would hold up in the population, or is there something specific about this sample? But notice I did say if there's random selection. Observational studies don't always have random selection, but sometimes they do. And I will say it's rare to have a study where you have both random selection and random assignment. Okay, so those are three broad categories of designs that we've talked about. So now let's talk about some different types of analysis. So for most of this semester, we've been focused on scenarios where the response variable is quantitative, and we've talked about two main types of analysis in this situation. So the first one that we learned is called ANOVA, and this is when you have one or more categorical variables. So usually if you hear people talking about ANOVA as a means of analysis, that means that all of their explanatory variables are categorical. So one or more categorical explanatory variables. And there's some specific names that we use depending on how many explanatory variables there are. So if there's only one, we would call that a one-way ANOVA. If you have more, like you can have a two-way ANOVA. We talked about that a lot. You can actually even have more. You could have three-way ANOVA if you had three different factors. But, obviously it gets more complicated, especially the interactions get more complicated as you go. But one-way, two-way, that refers to how many categorical explanatory variables you have. So with an ANOVA, all of your explanatory variables are categorical. If you're doing linear regression, that's usually when you have at least one quantitative explanatory variable. At least one quantitative explanatory variable. So you can combine this. You can have a linear regression model that has both categorical and quantitative variables in it. It's actually even possible to use linear regression with just categorical, but we don't usually call it that. Usually if we're calling it linear regression, that means that we have at least one quantitative variable. But I do have a note here. ANOVA and regression both involve linear models, so they're essentially two ways of describing the same thing, and any question you would answer with ANOVA can also be answered with regression, just switching over to indicator variables. So we'll actually see that in the next video to sort of see how we can go back and forth between ANOVA and regression. As far as significance tests for quantitative data, we've used t-test and we've used f-test. And basically the difference here is how many groups you're comparing or how many predictors you're looking at. So a t-test would be for looking at the difference between just two groups. So we have like a two-sample t-test. So if you're just looking at two groups, you could use a t-test, whereas an f-test allows you to test more than two groups. So it doesn't have to be more than two groups. You could still use an f-test even if there were only two groups. And in that case, the f would just be your t-statistic squared. But if you have more than two groups, the f-test is your only option. Another way to think about the use of a t-test is to test one predictor variable. So this is actually related to saying the difference between two groups, because if you think about testing the difference between two groups, you could use one indicator for that, right? You'd have a baseline group and then you would have one indicator. So again, you could use a t-test for that. Think about going back and forth. So a t-test is the difference between two groups or for testing one predictor. An f-test allows you to test more than two groups or more than one predictor. So if you wanted to look at a whole set of predictors all at once, then you would need to do an f-test for that. And we have talked about different types of f-tests. So there's the f-test that's given in the analysis of variance table, and that's looking at the overall model. So your null hypothesis in that case would either be that all of your means are equal to each other, like in an ANOVA context, or all of your predictors are equal to 0 in a linear regression context. So basically there's nothing interesting going on. There's no associations present. Whereas a partial f-test, instead of looking at the overall model, it's just looking at a set of predictors or a set of these means. An example of that would be testing all of the predictors associated with a single variable, so like multiple indicator variables that all correspond to the same non-binary categorical variable. We would want to test those indicators all at once with a partial f-test. And finally, at the end of the semester, we started working with categorical response variables, and there's two different options here. So you can use a chi-squared test of independence, but this is sort of limited. So this is only for the case where you have one categorical explanatory variable. So you would, organize your data in a two-way table, and then you could use a chi-squared test of independence to decide if the association was significant or not. Logistic regression does have one extra restriction, which is that the response must be binary. So everything for logistic regression is in terms of like the odds of successes and failures. So you do have to have a binary variable, but it allows for a lot more flexibility in terms of the explanatory variables. So it allows for categorical or quantitative predictors. And I'm going to put predictors with a S in parentheses because it could just be one. It could be simple linear regression where you have just one explanatory variable, or you could have a model with multiple explanatory variables so that you can look at the association with one while controlling for the rest. So hopefully these categories kind of help you to break things down when you see a new scenario, figure out which type of design you're working with and which type of analysis is appropriate.